we're going to look at the next verse in Zikhronot, and I'm going to share my screen. We're going to look at one long midrash today, longish midrash. That's going to be the main thing that we're going to look at, which is really going to look at the verse that's the verse that we're looking at from a classic how do I interpret these words situation, where certain words are repeating, certain words are associated with some of the characters in the verse and not others. You'll see what I mean, but it's going to hopefully lead to some meaningful understanding of this verse. From the end of the curses in Bechukotai in Vayikra comes this hopeful coda. V'zacharti et briti Yaakov, ve'af et briti Yitzchak, ve'af et briti Avraham eskor, v'haaretz eskor. Then will I remember my covenant with Jacob. I will remember also, that's how they're translating af, also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. So just, if you notice, just look at the verse, you'll see that there are certain unusual features. First of all, v'zacharti is related to Yaakov. Abraham has eskor. The land has eskor, but Yitzchak has no verb of zocher. So that's one thing to note. And we have the af and af, which is for Yitzchak and Abraham, but not for Yaakov, sort of in addition to Yaakov. And also, normally we think of this threesome as Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, not Yaakov, Yitzchak, and Abraham. So that's another sort of aspect there. And then we also have thrown in at the end the land. The land I will remember as well, as opposed to just the Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov trio. So all that's going to come up in the midrash and try to make sense of all that. I just wanted to note this is our last of the 3 Torah verses for Zikhronot, and actually in all the other ancient traditions of the Machzor, this pasuk does not appear. The one that you might expect to appear, which does not appear in our version of the Machzor, is the request that Moshe says during the praying around the golden calf. Zechor Abraham, Yitzchak, Yisrael Avadecha. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel and Yaakov. That would seem to be a fitting verse to use on Yom Kippur, which is also reminiscent of the sin of the golden calf and the reconciliation from that, and does appear in a number of ancient traditions, but doesn't appear in any of the traditions that we use today. This is the verse that we have. So it's just interesting that you wouldn't have had to go with this verse, but here it is, and we're going to try to make some sense of it. So first of all, I want to backtrack from something I said yesterday, which is yesterday I said there's no more zchut avot, and therefore we have to just rely on tshuva, on repentance. We can't rely on our ancestors. But Rabbeinu Tam, one of the famous Tosafos, says that actually there's a distinction between zchut avot, the merit of the ancestors, and brit avot. Omer Rabbeinu Tam, zchut avot tamah. It's true that zchut avot does not exist anymore; it has ended. Aval brit avot lo tamah, but the covenant of the ancestors has not ended, because it's written, our verse, v'zacharti et briti Yaakov, etc. La'achar galut. Even after galut, that is to say, even after all those curses take place in Bechukotai, we still call upon the brit avot, the covenant of the ancestors. We don't mention the zchut avot anymore, but we do mention the brit avot. So what the distinction is between zchut avot and brit avot, not exactly clear, but there's something operative about the covenant that God makes with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov that survives the end of zchut avot. So perhaps the brit is going to be something that will be in our favor, even if we might still focus on our tshuva as the main orienting motivator for why God should forgive us. Okay, let's take a look at the way the Midrash reads our verse. This shows up in the Sifra and also in Vayikra Rabbah. I just brought you the Vayikra Rabbah one. So they're going to take each strange thing about the verse one by one. Lama ne'emru avot achoranit. Why were the patriarchs listed in backwards order? Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham, as opposed to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Klomar, that's to tell you that if there were no good deeds in Jacob, then Isaac's deeds would suffice. And if Isaac's deeds didn't suffice, then Avram's deeds would suffice. Okay, so you're sort of backing it up one generation each time and hoping that it would work enough with Yaakov. If not, then Yitzchak. If not, then Abraham, as opposed to the other way around. even though that the Midrash then seems to say, Kedai kol echad ve'echad. Actually, each one would be enough to, to bear the burden. But nevertheless, the verse states it this way in case for some reason Yaakov and Yitzchak don't work, we can back up all the way to Abraham. Okay, that's why it goes backwards. Now, B'lama ne'emar ba'Avraham u'b'Yaakov zechira u'b'Yitzchak lo ne'emar zechira. So how come it says Vayiskor related to Yaakov and Ezkor related to Abraham, but Yitzchak doesn't have the verb zocher? There's no verb associated with Yitzchak, which the Midrash notices. So we have two opinions, Rabbi Brechia and Rabbanan. Rabbi Brechia and the majority Rabbanan opinion. Both of them are going to say that Yitzchak has a special status. I think it's interesting to consider this for a moment. Rabbi Brechia Amar, Al Yidei Shaya ben Yisurin. Why was Yitzchak not? Why was the word Zocher not related to Yitzchak in this verse? Because Yitzchak was a child of suffering, someone who suffered, and we know that Yitzchak had a difficult childhood when his father tried to sacrifice him. That's obviously something we're going to read on Rosh Hashanah on day 2. And in general, has a sort of a suffering sense about him. He has the inability to see clearly, and there are certain aspects that are sort of tragic about his life. So as a child of suffering, perhaps God doesn't need to remember Yitzchak because God always remembers Yitzchak. That is to say, the suffering, people who suffer are always present with God. God doesn't need to specifically do an act of Zocher, like God does need to do with Abraham and Yaakov, but rather someone who is suffering is always in the consciousness of God, and therefore there's no special need for a Zikhronot, for a Zocher side. And Rabbanan, although they have a different opinion, sort of along the same lines, Rabbanan Amrin, Ro'in afro shel Yitzchak ki'ilu hu tzavor al gabei hamizbeach. Actually, God doesn't need to remember Yitzchak because Yitzchak's ashes, as it were on the altar. In the Midrashic tradition, Yitzchak actually was sacrificed on the altar, and then comes back to life. Mechaya Meitim. That's why the second bracha of the Amid is associated with Yitzchak. And therefore, either God sort of sees this set of ashes on the altar and is therefore not needed to be reminded of it. It's just there as an ever-present reminder. And that's a theme that we see in Zikhronot, of God remembering the Akedah specifically as something to book to our merits. Okay, we'll just move on the Midrash. How come the word af is used with Abraham and Yitzchak, but not used with Yaakov? Because mitato shel Avinu Yaakov shlema, because the bed or the children of Yaakov were perfect, were whole, whereas Abraham and Yitzchak gave birth to people who started, other nations outside of the family. And in that way, the af, which, maybe the one translation I was looking at says that it's the anger, like charon af. So maybe there's an af, there's a negative side associated with Yitzchak and Abraham, not associated with Yaakov, and that's why af is only with Abraham and Yitzchak and not Yaakov. Let's move on to an interesting appearance of the imahot. So far, we've only had zchut avot and brit avot, but there is a zchut imahot, and actually my dad was on the call, wrote an article about this. So this is another source talking about the zchut imahot, or the connection that God has with the imahot and not just the avot. So in the el avot, I only have the avot as part of the covenant here. Imahot minayin, but I know that imahot are also part of the covenant. How do I know it? Talmud lomar et. Okay, so what's this? If you remember in the verse, I'll just scroll back up to the verse. It says, "V'zacharti et briti Yaakov, v'af et briti Yitzchak, v'af et briti Avraham eskor." So you have three ets, three direct object signifiers. But we're going to see that that's not what we're referring to. The et actually refers to the imahot. Ve'ein etim ela imahot. The etim actually refer to the imahot. Shneemar. Shama kavru et Avraham ve'et Sarah ishto. Shama kavru et Yitzchak ve'et Rivka ishto. Ve'shama kavarti et Leah. This is Yaakov talking, sort of recounting his life at the end of Breshit, and saying an et before Sarah, Rivka, and Leah. Interesting, Rachel is not here, and you have three ets and three imahot. So normally we have Rachel and the imahot, but this seems to be at least one version in which the imahot, the zchut imahot, we're talking about the three imahot. Maybe sort of Rachel gets absorbed into that as well, but we know that we're not just talking about avot, we're also talking about the imahot. And we'll end with the last one, which is the God to also mention the land. So we have this beautiful little parable here. Rish Lakish said it's like a king who had three sons, and one of the and a shifcha, one of the maids, helped raise the children. When the king inquired after the welfare of his sons, he would say, also inquire after the welfare of the shifcha, of the maid. So similarly, when the Holy One Blessed mentions the patriarchs, the avot, God also mentions the land, which somehow seems to be playing this role of helping servants. It's not just not just the avot that are playing a role here, but also the land itself.